Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special episode of JTV. I'm thrilled to be joined by Rabbi and historian Ken Spiro, who's joining us from Israel. He's been on the program a bunch of times now. And today, I thought it's time for us to myth bust the lies that are smeared across Israel's name, and is in many ways is what fuels the hostility to Israel. These notions of the Jews came there and just stole the land, that they're colonizers, that in 1948 they just intentionally displaced all the Arabs, that they are some kind of foreign alien entity that has no right to be there. We need to know the answers to these accusations, because if we don't, then the lies will continue to spread. And I don't think enough people have enough clarity on these matters, particularly around what happened in the build up to Israel's birth and immediately afterwards. And that's what they pin so much of the smearing on, the shaming of Israel on, of what happened then. And so who better than to speak to a deeply knowledgeable historian that knows the facts, that can tell us in detail what actually took place. So, Rabbi, thank you so much for making the time to be here. Greatly appreciate it. I think we need to start off, before we get to the 20th century and what happened in Israel's inception, is just get a bit of background on the Jewish people's ancient connection to this land, because we get all kinds of smears of, well, some people even denying there was an original Jewish state thousands of years ago. But then on top of that, they might say, well, yeah, maybe there was, but the Jews of today don't have any direct connection to that. So just could you start off by telling us a bit about the broader history and connection?
Sure. Okay. First of all, thanks for having me on. You're right, 100%. There's the narrative, then there's the truth. And as is a great line, facts don't care about your feelings. If you're really into truth, you got to put your subjectivity aside. I'm going to approach this objectively. And the reality is very few people do that. They just want to hear the facts they want to hear and ignore the rest. But the other thing I wanted to add is a kind of introduction. If anyone's really interested in this topic, as much as I'll try and impart as much information as possible, everyone really needs to make an effort on their own to, do a little research, build up their own base of knowledge as opposed to just absorbing from others. That's how I do everything myself. You got to have your own, your own database in your brain to pull out of. I'm happy to also suggest maybe you can post a number of really good sources that people could access and read if they want to do some further reading on the topic. But what you're asking is a really good, the first question you're asking is an excellent question, because we have to start with defining some basic terms. First of all, Jew, I'm a tour guide in Israel, along with being a historian. And I always ask people before I start guiding, what's being Jewish? Are we a religion? Are we a race, a family, a nation, an ethnicity, a people, a culture? And people always say, we're all of them. We're not, we are most of them. The one thing we're not is a race. Although it's interesting, another interesting side point is there's a common genetic origin of the Jewish people. For everyone who's Jewish in the world today, there are probably hundreds of millions of non-Jews with Jewish blood. That's number one. So a lot of people have left the Jewish people, and because anyone can join, thus proving we're not a race. You cannot join a race. You can join the Jewish people. Our gene pool has been augmented, but the core of who we are this is a provable genetic point, the Middle Eastern haplotype, that all Jewish communities around the world, regardless of the pigment of their skin, those who spent too long in Northern Europe and lost their melanin, and those who stayed in the Middle East and kept it, we are all actually very much related to each other as a people. But we're not just a religion like being a Catholic. We're not just a nation like being an American, a Canadian, or a British person. We are an ethno-religion. And we're one of the oldest surviving peoples on the planet Earth. If you actually read in the Bible about all the nations we interact with, Assyrians and Babylonians and Hyksos and Jebusites and ancient Egyptians, these people are pretty much all gone. To meet them, you have to go to museums. So we are a nation, one of the oldest surviving nations. And our origins begin, if we're just following our traditionally accepted chronology, around the time of what we call Abraham as our great-great-grandfather. which goes back to a period of time called the Middle Bronze period. He is not from the land of Israel. We Jews originate in what is basically Iraq, Ur, which is the bottom of the Euphrates River. So that is our origins. It's Middle Eastern, but it's not exactly in the land of Israel. Abraham will migrate into the land of Israel about 3,700 years ago via Turkey, via a place called Haran. The only people who can make a claim to be older and more indigenous to the land of Israel than the Jewish people would be Canaanites, Canaanim, as we say in Hebrew. And it's a generic term that describes, again, this is more or less, since we don't have ancient history books from this time, we can only piece together some things from archaeology and also from what Jewish tradition talks about. Jewish tradition doesn't hide the fact that the Canaanites are the original inhabitants of the land of Israel. That's why when Abraham first comes in, he says, I'm a stranger in a strange land. And the Canaanites are actually 7 different ethnic groups. There's Hittites and Perizzites and Jebusites, and they live in 31 little city-states. Each little city's a state, kind of like what it was before it became a country. In the later 19th century, you had Milan, Florence, Rome, Genoa. So they're actually different groups of people, even somewhat ethnically different, but generically called Italians. So those are the original inhabitants of the land. And the Canaanites will disappear. When we conquer the land, we battle the Canaanites. Many of their city-states are destroyed by the Jewish people. This is true. Some join the Jewish people, some escape, and some exist amongst the Jewish people for hundreds and hundreds of years after. But like so many ancient peoples, they lost their genetic materials floating around there in the world, but there's no longer anyone identifiable as Canaanites today. So these are the only people who could be more indigenous to the land of Israel of today than the Jewish people. But we could say that our first presence in the land begins with Abraham, like 3,700 years ago, Middle Bronze period. But the national connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel begins with the famous Exodus narrative that's commemorated by the holiday of Passover. We go into Egypt as a family. We stay hundreds of years in Egypt and develop from a family to a nation. This is all the biblical account, of course. And then
can I just pause for a second just to ask, was it not the case though that Shem, right, one of Noah's children, who is an ancestor of Abraham and the Jewish people, he was originally given that portion of the land in which the land of Israel is, and then the Canaanites came and took over, invaded that territory. Is that documented?
That is not. First of all, it's definitely not said anywhere in the Bible. That I've never seen that actual tradition. I mean, you're going back to the flood story that, after the flood, that the world is repopulated. That's a whole other debate on science and anthropology and how does that work. And I don't think we should go into that now. But I'm just talking about the Jewish people's identifiable separate group, because
of course,
the children of Noah are the progenitors of many different groups of people. Jewish tradition says that the word Semitic, by the way, comes from the word Shem, who's one of Noah's 3 sons. And it's used to refer anthropologically to Middle Eastern peoples. So Arabs are, in the modern sense of the word, a Semitic people. Jews are a Semitic people. There's other different groups of people who could qualify themselves as Semitic, but that initial connection is a little hard to trace back. I've never actually seen anything on.
But the Canaanites wouldn't have been Semitic, I don't think.
No, the Canaanites actually Jewish tradition. Again, we're dealing with things that lack any real scientific or anthropological proof, and we can't identify. If we could find a Canaanite tomb with verifiable Canaanite DNA and try and compare it, maybe we have some. I'm not aware of such a thing, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Then maybe we could try and tie them into other people. For instance, like Phoenicians are Middle Eastern people who are related to the Canaanites. The city of Tyre off of Lebanon. That was another. These are indigenous populations to the Mediterranean coast in the Middle East. But what we're talking about, the Jewish, right? So our origins are Middle Eastern people. We wander into the land in the Exodus narrative. We conquer and settle the land of Israel, and this is dated to about 3,300 years ago. So the only other inhabitants that are immediately in our geographic area are Canaanites. And we're dealing with if you read the narrative in the Hebrew Bible, which describes the confrontations and battles that the ancient Israelites fight, they're fighting with different peoples that surround us. You have Moabites and you have Ammonites and different people who are invading. And we're fighting ancient Egyptians who are, again, are not the same as the modern Egyptians. That's another mistake people make, that people settle in a piece of real estate and new people flood into that area, and we assume they're definitely connected to the same people who lived there previously, even though they may have the same country name, Egypt. The ancient Egyptian DNA is in there, but Egypt was overrun multiple times by many different peoples who are not originally from that area, as was the entire Middle East, which just makes this much more confusing. But to make it simple, to try and keep it straight, is basically there's been a Jewish national presence in the land of Israel for about 3,300 years. And if we wanted to run through the chronology, there's just the simple chronology is we conquer and settle the land. Jewish tradition describes the land being divided up by tribes. It's kind of like the United States. Like, imagine a guy has 50 sons and he gives each of them a state. And Jerusalem, by the way, remains a non-Jewish Canaanite city in the heart of a Jewish country for 440 years, occupied by the Jebusites, all during the period of Judges. After 440 years, we transition out of a loose confederation of tribal states with no central authority to kingship and monarchy. We have King Saul for a few years, and then along comes the Davidic dynasty, which is the official royal dynasty of the Jewish people, from whom all legitimate kings come from this dynasty, and ultimately Jewish tradition says the Messiah comes. King David will conquer the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusite inhabitants. He actually purchases the upper part of the hill of their ancient city, which Jewish tradition connects to that famous binding of Isaac story in Genesis chapter 22 as the one and only unique holy spot, because we're not just a nation, we're a spiritual nation. We pick our capital city for spiritual reasons, and Jerusalem is the one intrinsically holy place. That's the place where God commands Abraham to bring Isaac up to offer him as a sacrifice. There's a place, it's a place of natural connectivity. The Jewish tradition says all prayers ascend from that spot. So it's the logical place to ultimately build what's the holiest object in the world for the Jewish people, which is called the tabernacle, or in Hebrew, the Mishkan, which for many hundreds of years was a prefabricated tent structure with a courtyard. In the inner room, called the Holy of Holies, was kept the Ark of the Covenant. For more on that, you can read the Raiders of the Lost. You can watch the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie. It's a wooden box gilded in gold in which the tablets that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai were kept within. That was schlepped around in the desert for 40 years. And then for 440 years before we conquered Jerusalem, it was in 4 different places in the land of Israel during the period of Judges. King David brings the Ark to Jerusalem. His son, Solomon, will build what's called the first temple. And this is the beginning of the first commonwealth, as we call it, which is, and again, the other thing you have to make clear is that the biblical boundaries of the land of Israel are not identical to the modern boundaries of the state of Israel today, excluding issues of territories disputed in Gaza and, Judea and Samaria. It just was laid out a little bit differently, a little more in the north, a little more to the east is ancient Israel, less in the south. Don't want to go through that now. But we call that Jewish state that existed as like the first republic. It wasn't a republic, but the first commonwealth will exist for, Jewish tradition says, 410 years, with a central spiritual site and political center in the city of Jerusalem. And then that will be destroyed we're subject, the Middle East is always being overrun by different world powers. There'll be many invasions. For more on that, you can read the Book of Kings or the Book of Judges. But about 2,500 years ago, the Babylonian Empire, which is today in Iraq, will overrun the kingdom of Judah and exile the vast majority of the population to what is today Iraq for 70 years and destroy that temple. And after that, we come back and establish a second commonwealth where a second temple is built in Jerusalem. The country kind of rebuilds itself, but there's very little political independence. We have Persian occupation and Greek occupation, Roman occupation, multiple revolts against the Romans, which lead to destruction and further exile 420 years later. So by the time you get to the year 70, you got to do the math. For 830 years, there was a central religious site in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. For an additional, 440 years, we had a Jewish state in the land of Israel before Jerusalem was a capital. So that's a really long period of time we're dealing with. Where people get confused is after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and another big revolt a little bit later, the Jewish population in the land of Israel declines precipitously because the persecution, economic instability, many different factors, so that by the time you get to about 1,500 years ago, the vast majority of Jews who survived all these revolts and rebellions have moved elsewhere out of the land of Israel, to Babylon, to Egypt, and eventually spread to the Mediterranean, the entire world. So there was always a Jewish population in the land of Israel, but those numbers varied dramatically throughout history. And again, because we are a nation, this has always been the place we've desired to go back to and prayed to return to.
Yeah. So Jews always maintained a presence there, even though most of them were forcefully displaced and forced into exile. And then we started seeing a much greater return from the 1800s onwards with the birth of the Zionist movement. And so let's start off with two big misconceptions people have. Number one is there are some who think that as the Jews returned, they were just displacing the Arabs. The second question is also, let's talk about how these Arabs got there and who they are. Third question is how much of the land was built up, how much was desolate. So what did the land look like? And the fourth question is, and sorry to throw so many at you, so I'm glad, I think you're maybe writing it down. Yeah. The fourth question is, what about those who say that those, especially in Europe, the European Jews, they have no connection with those Jews of ancient times? So throw those questions out to you. And then, after that, we can get to 1948.
Okay, so first of all, what's with a couple of things we have to, and this is not PC, but it's facts, and facts are not necessarily politically correct. First of all, the whole term Palestine, we have to deal with that because that deals with the Arab connection to the land of Israel. After the Third Great Revolt against the Romans in the year 132 CE to the year 135, called the Bar Kokhba Revolt, which was the biggest revolt in the history of the Roman Empire, where Israel threw Rome out of the land of Israel, was an independent state for 2 years. By that time, the Romans were so fed up with the Jewish people that they basically, this is during the reign of the Roman general Hadrian. Now, by the way, none of this is debatable. And all the earlier history I said, people say it's anywhere you dig in archaeology, and I actually work in archaeology. I've dug many years in the city of David. You go through many layers of civilization, many of which are not necessarily Jewish, early Islamic, etc., late Islamic. You have Crusaders, but you go back and you get to the Jewish stuff. There's no debate. This is not open for any debate. We have an Egyptian document going back 3,300 years ago, which mentions Israel. So we got to get past that nonsense. But the term, when the Romans, after that revolt, the Romans decide we've had enough of you Jews. We're going to end you in both your kind of forms of who you are. We're going to end you religiously by persecuting your faith out of existence, which leads to many rabbis being martyred because they won't give up their faith or publicly teaching Torah, like the famous Rabbi Akiva story of being skinned alive by the Romans. And we're going to cut off your national connection to your country. So what we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to level what remains of where your temple stood, which had already been destroyed earlier. We're going to build a Roman temple to Jupiter on it, of which nothing remains today. That's the ultimate insult. We are going to ban you Jews from your capital city, except on the 9th of Av, the date in the Jewish calendar where both the first and second temples were destroyed. We'll let you come in so we can rub your face in it. We are going to rename every city in the country a non-Jewish name. We're going to take the city of Shechem, where Joseph is sold, the rape of Dinah story, all this Shechem's very much in the. We're going to rename it Naples, which is a nice kind of Italian sounding name. We're going to rename Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina. Aelia is Publius Aelius Hadrianus. It's Hadrian's middle name, the emperor. And Capitolina, the capital city, which is actually another name for Jupiter, the main city. And like a city like Naples, it's interesting, ironic, that in Arabic, there's no P sound. There's a F, but not a P. So now the city of Naples is called by Arabs Nablus, which is why Banyas in the north of Israel is actually named after the Greek god Pan, the guy with the human body and the goat legs. But because in Arabic there's no pa, he's Ban, not Pan. So it's Banyas. So that's an interesting little side point right there. But they were going to rename the entire country, which we used to call Judea after you Jews. We're going to rename it after a people who have been gone literally for like over 700 years, way before the Philistines. The Philistines disappear. Now, Philistines, by the way, are not indigenous to this part of the world. They come probably from the area of Greece and Mycenae and migrate thousands of years ago to the Middle East. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob interact with them. King David's interacting with them. But they will disappear about 2,500 years ago. But the name is carried on by Greek and Roman historians. So the Romans say, you know what, we're not going to call it Judea anymore as a way of totally erasing the Jewish connection to their homeland. We'll just call it the whole area is called Greater Syria. We'll call it Syria Palestina. So that name will carry on till modern times. That's very important. So we have to distinguish between the name that a certain group of people who are Arabs identify themselves with and the geographic designation put into place by the Roman Empire and later used by many other countries all the way into modernity, even the great colonial powers like the British going back into recent centuries. So that's number one, super important point. Number two is, and this is 100% true fact, the foreign colonizers of this part of the Middle East are Arabs. Okay, Arabs. Now remember this, we have Jordanians and Iraqis today and Syrians. These are all modern countries created by the British and the French. Islam begins in the 7th century, but Arabs are indigenous to the Arabian Peninsula, more or less what is Saudi Arabia and UAE and all those parts, nomadic peoples who basically inhabited south of where I am today. Once Islam takes off as a major face in the 7th century, and Islam behaves very much not just as a religion, but as an empire and a very expansionist empire, Islam, of all the three monotheistic faiths, is the most aggressive in its expansionist ideology, the idea of jihad, of conquering. Islam will rapidly expand in the late 7th and to mid 8th century, very dramatically, way after Muhammad is gone, the founder of Islam, into the entire Middle East, taking North Africa, taking over even the Persian Empire. And it keeps expanding into Spain in 711, and you name it. The Muslims will show up as foreign colonialist occupiers. In 638, they will conquer what is today the land of Israel, which previously was controlled by whom? It was controlled by the Persian Empire. Okay, but actually the Persian, in between, I have to clarify myself, excuse me, they actually conquered it from the Byzantine Empire. The Persians controlled it for a short period of time in the 7th century, taking it from the Byzantines. It goes back and forth. But the Byzantines, who are the Eastern Roman Christian Empire that lived in whose capital was Constantinople, that is today Istanbul, were the previous occupiers. So what you see is basically from the exile of the Jewish people under Roman occupation, you have then Roman Christian occupation under the Byzantines, the Persians show up, the Byzantines come back, and the Muslims show up. So it's a series of foreign occupiers, including Muslims, who will conquer the land of Israel. And from 638 until 1917, different Islamic, this is a really important point because we tend to conflate Islam and Muslims and Arabs, excuse me. Most Islam begins as a religion of the nomadic Arabic-speaking people of the Arabian Peninsula 1,300 years ago, but it spreads to many, 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 many other places, even including out to places like Indonesia, which is the largest Islamic nation in the world today. So while there are Christian Arabs, most Arabs are Muslims, but most Muslims are not Arabs. 70% of Muslims in the world are not Arabs. Persians aren't Arabs. Turks aren't Arabs. The Iranians are the Persians. Indonesians aren't Arabs. Pakistani, they're all Muslims. So from 638 until 1917, when the British show up at the end of World War I, different Islamic, not necessarily Arab states, will control what is today considered the land of Israel and many other territories around them. Umayyads, Abbasids, Ayyubids, Mamluks, Seljuks, Ottomans, how many of them will have a capital in Jerusalem? The answer is 0. Who has a capital in Jerusalem besides the Jewish people in the last 3,300 years? And if you're saying no one, you're not right, actually. There's only one group of people who did that, which is the one exception to Islamic control of this part of the Middle East for the last 1,300 years, the Crusaders. From 1099 to 1187, a bunch of basically Norman knights who were originally descended from Vikings descended on the Middle East through Turkey and conquered Jerusalem, slaughtering all the Jews and the Muslims in the city. And from 1099 to 1187, there was a Christian kingdom centered in Jerusalem with Baldwin, the king of, it was the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. And they're definitely not indigenous to this part of the world either. So I've already clarified a really important point. There have been Arabs in this part of in the Arabian Peninsula, have been Arabs for a really long time, but in the land of Israel, of what is today, and this part of the Middle East along the coast, including what is Egypt and North Africa and all those places where there are large Arab Muslim populations today, that is relatively recent in history within the last 1,300 years.
Got it. Okay. But what about some of my other questions that I asked, specifically around the Jews in Europe and whether people that say that they don't have a connection, and also about what happened as the Jews started returning in the 1800s en masse. This idea that they were somehow just forcing out people from their homes, and then also questions around, you know, who really are, whose land is this historically?
Okay, so in terms, well, we're talking about who invaded the land of Israel, and we talked about the Jews shrinking, the population shrinking to very little. Where did those Jews go? I mean, a lot of them were killed out. It's a PhD thesis I'm never going to write, that I believe a far higher percentage of Jews were killed between the years 66 CE and 135 CE in three great revolts in the Mediterranean against the Romans. Numerically, maybe not as many as died in the Holocaust, but percentage-wise, I personally think 2/3 of the Jews in the world were killed in that period of time. So we were decimated demographically. It'd be an interesting thing to try and prove. But we also, even those of us who survive, we already have to remember that there is already a diaspora community. Diaspora is the Greek word for scattering. Until the destruction of the first temple 2,500 years ago, all Jews lived in the land of Israel. They may have gone on occasional trading missions and gone to Miami for vacation, but they were all living in the land of Israel. Once the Second Temple is established, going back about 2,400 years ago, the Second Commonwealth, that the diaspora community remains in Babylon of today. That Iraqi Jewish community, by the way, predates the arrival of Muslims there by like 1,000 years. Think about that. There were Jews living, what is today Iraq, which is an Arab Muslim country, way before any Arabs lived in Iraq, because back when the Jews were living there, they were Babylonians. Wow. Or Persians, like that. So these people, these Arab armies moved into all these places, and now the term Arab is even a weird term to use, because the broadest definition of Arab is people who speak Arabic. There's really no ethnic definition for an Arab, by the way. There's so many different peoples subsumed into Arab expansion, Berbers in North Africa and all these different peoples of the Middle East. But so the beginning of a diaspora community begins there, but the explosion of the diaspora community begins with the Roman persecution and the revolts in the land of Israel. Between Jews just being forced out or fleeing, or, very important, and this is like the great Jewish historian Josephus talks about this, and he lived through the destruction of the first temple, massive numbers of Jews were taken as captives and sold as slaves, primarily to Italy, to the point where it was stated that a Jewish slave was cheaper than a horse. And generally after land, slaves were the most valuable thing a person owned. A measure of wealth was how much land you owned and how many slaves you had. We Jews will flee to different places outside of the Roman sphere of influence, which includes what is Babylon. We will end up in Italy, many as slaves, many who were redeemed. Interesting genetically that Ashkenazi Jews, if you do genetic testing, are genetically, and when I say Ashkenaz, we have to define our terms here. The Jewish community of the world is basically, it's a little more nuanced than this, but basically divided into two groups of people. We call them Ashkenazi and Sephardi. Ashkenazi Jews it's the word for Germany, but Jews who ended up in Europe in the Christian world. Sephardi means Spanish, and there was a very significant Jewish community in Spain from the 8th to the 11th centuries, which was expelled in 1492, but it's generally used to refer to Jews who stayed in the Islamic world, which could be in Europe, which is Spain, or the Middle East. So that's the big division. What happened is initially with the decline of Israel, most Jews stayed pretty local. 1,000 years ago, the vast majority of Jews in the world were their first language. 90% of the Jews in the world 1,000 years ago, their first language was Arabic, and they lived within the Islamic sphere of influence, which would be the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. And a small Ashkenazi community of some tens of thousands of Jews living in mostly southern France and the Rhineland in Germany and Italy. And it's interesting that genetically, we do testing of Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, of whom I am, tend to be with 45 to 75% genetically Italian, which could explain why we get along so well with Italians. But that has largely to do with a massive number of probably Jews being pushed into Italy after the Great Revolt, sold as slaves, and intermingling with the local population, which means that a lot of non-Jews joined the Jewish population, which explains the genetic diversity of the Jewish people today. Because there's another myth that, all Jews are white people. Because if you go to America, America is overwhelmingly, and England, overwhelmingly populated by Jews who are from that Ashkenazic population, who will eventually migrate into Eastern Europe. We have a huge population explosion in Eastern Europe, where 200 years ago, 5.5 million Jews are living in Eastern Europe. That's huge. Biggest population in the world. And then they migrate to America. And that's so people who live in Europe aren't necessarily used to dealing with Sephardic Jews. Whereas if you lived in the Middle East or in France today, most of those Jews they look different from and they have their origins come from a different part of the Middle East after the expulsions of the Jews from the land of Israel. But slight differences in skin color aside, which does not prove your relationship to anyone is the color of your skin, by the way. It's your genetic material. As I mentioned previously, every Jewish community in the world, with the exception of Ethiopian Jews, whose origins are very much debated, it's not because they're black. There are other communities of Jews who are extremely dark-skinned, who no one debates their connection to the Jewish people. We all share what's called a Middle Eastern Jewish haplotype, a genetic signature, which proves that we're actually, skin color and eye color and hair color aside, very similarly related to each other on a much deeper level than what was caused by a microevolutionary process of maybe a genetic bottleneck of us coming from a very few people in Europe or living in a very northern part of Europe where it was better to be lighter skinned, which explains the differences in many people's skin colors throughout time. But as to the notion you probably wanted to ask about the myth of Jews who descended from Khazars, which I don't know if you wanted to address that, but there's a myth thrown around to delegitimize, especially Ashkenazi Jewry.
Yeah.
There was a community in what is between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. This is in Jewish tradition. There's much speculation and a lot of questions about it. But it seems that around the 8th to the 11th centuries, the upper leadership of that kingdom converted to Judaism. And it could be that a very significant percentage of the people of what's called Khazariya converted to Judaism. So you had a multi-ethnic, multi-religious community that was ruled by Jews who were converts to Judaism. Again, there's so much. I've read so much on the Khazars, and they're excavating in their area today, and we don't really know how many there were, what exactly happened. But we do know that between pressure from the Turks from the south and the kingdom of the Rus, the Viking Rus from the north, the kingdom was destroyed, and they were either killed or fled. And there's that opinion that they have fled to Europe, and they're the ones who are Ashkenazi Jews today. So while there might be Khazar blood mixed in with Jews, as I already said, if you do the genetic testing on me, who tested 100% Ashkenazi, I was hoping for at least 3% Neanderthal. I am genetically much more closely related to Jacob Mizrahi from Iraq than I am to the neighbors that my great grandparents lived next to in Northeast Poland, who may have had a closer skin color to me than I have to Jacob Mizrahi in Iraq, because the deeper genetic connections are still there. But like I said, a lot of people have joined the Jewish people and augmented our genetic profile and made us more colorful and diverse, and a lot of people have left.
So
but we are
just very conscious of time, because I do want to get to the key bits of what happened in 48 and all the myths around Jews just going in and stealing the land, all this kind of thing. Anyway, even if that statement's even ridiculous, given the fact that we were kicked out of the land, right? It's our land to reclaim. But let's talk about. Can you talk to us a bit about sort of what happened as the Jews returned en masse, and also about in the early 20th century, the hostilities that they faced, and the beginnings of the anti-Semitic. I guess at the time they may have called it a Palestinian cause. It kind of developed more in the 60s, but the sort of the Nazi origins actually of that movement.
Absolutely. So the time period frame you're talking about with the beginning of Zionism, which is dated to 1882, and the first Aliyah, the first wave of Jews from Romania, primarily back to the land of Israel to try and resettle it and reestablish a national homeland, which is part of the larger nationalistic movement that was sweeping through all of Europe at the time. That's the late Ottoman Turkish period. And that's the end of the Ottoman Empire, which hundreds of years before was a superpower country, and by this point was called the sick man of Europe. And the fringes of the Ottoman Empire, of which Palestine, Israel was part of, were not very stable areas. There wasn't a lot going on economically there, and they weren't very safe places to be. And the population was actually dwindling. I've seen a bunch of different statistics on this. Joan Peters wrote a book called From Time Immemorial, which is a fascinating survey demonstrating where most of the modern era population came from. And it was opposite what she thought, and basically showing that the vast majority of the Arab population that lives in Israel today had actually, even though Muslims and Arabs have been in the land of Israel for 1,300 years, the majority of the population migrated in fairly recently. And let me give the background to that. Late Ottoman period, late 19th century, political instability, very little economic opportunity. The population is shrinking. Mark Twain came in the mid-19th century. And he wrote a book called Innocents Abroad. And he says, we reached Jerusalem safely. We barely saw a human being on the whole route. Even the olive and cactus, those fast friends of the worthless soul, had almost deserted the country. He goes on to describe how completely desolate and barren the land of Israel was. No people, nothing going on agriculturally. The population was fleeing because there was nothing going on. With the advent of Zionism, and Jews started to come back, and we're the great economic hothouse always in human history. Where Jews go, progress and development always follows, because we never sit still. And especially when we get back to our land and are so fired up to make it bloom again, which is all of what, and that was a real hard project because we forgot how to be farmers. Jews are better at being accountants nowadays than doctors and lawyers. Farming has not been a thing we did for a long time, being an urbanized people. But with the influx of Jews, economic opportunities increase because laborers are needed. So more Arabs start to move in to the area. I saw a statistic that in 1880, they did a survey. The Turks did population surveys. They did a survey of the population of the land of Israel, and it was less than 500,000 people living in the land of Israel, which is less than half the population of Jerusalem. And that population is shrinking.
Wow.
In comes the Jews. And then with World War I, which is the final straw that destroys the Ottoman Turkish Empire, the British conquer the land of Israel from the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which ceases to exist. And British bring in Western technology and soldiers and more economic opportunities. Jewish immigration is increasing. Now, when they say Jewish immigration is increasing, where are they living? So you have to understand the land is mostly barren. And land ownership was based on an Ottoman Turkish, until today in the land of Israel. The Supreme Court of Israel uses a document called the Tabu, which is the Ottoman Turkish Land Survey, which is hundreds of years old, which registers land ownership based on what was going on in the Ottoman Turkish time. Huge tracts of land in the land of Israel were owned by absentee landlords living in Cairo and Damascus and Baghdad. And they were willing to sell it gladly to Jews because it was basically desert. As a matter of fact, from the time of the Crusades on, the entire coastal plain of Israel was deliberately denuded of its population, from Jaffa to Haifa. It's amazing. Beachfront property was completely empty because the Muslims were afraid if we establish any settlement there, the Christian Crusaders will come back and occupy the land. So what did the Jews do? They went in and bought it all. If you look at a map of where the early partition plans of the British are, the whole coast of Israel is going to be a Jewish state because there was no one living there. There is no example, Ali, of any Jews coming to the land of Israel and forcing Arabs out of their houses from the early 20th century all the way through into the war. It did not happen. Not happening at all. But there are plenty of Arab landowners. A lot of the Arabs living in the land didn't own it. They were tenant farmers or living in the cities, like in Jerusalem or something, which is a little rundown backwater province at the time. Nothing going on there. But the Arab landowners were very happy because the Jews would pay overinflated. I saw a statistic once that an acre of mosquito-infested, malaria-prone swampland in the Hula Valley sold for significantly more than an acre of prime real estate in Iowa in the beginning of the 20th century. But we were willing to buy it. And we turned the swamps into the richest agricultural area. We made the desert bloom. So the Jewish population comes back and is buying specifically in the part of the Negev and the Galilee Finger and the coast of Israel, all land purchased by the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, whose primary function at the beginning of the 20th century was legal purchase of land from legally established landowners. And with the influx of the Jewish population and the British population and waves of aliyot, of immigrants coming in, we then start to see an increase in the Arab population in the land of Israel because of the economic opportunities. And cities like Tel Aviv were founded, all these places you're talking about. And Tel Aviv was only founded in 1909. But with that also, we have the British put into power a man, by rigging the election, a man by the name of the Mufti, Hajj al-Min al-Husseini. There's a chief religious authority in Jerusalem. The British are now running the show here. And the Mufti, they put him in power, and he is a virulently anti-Semitic Arab. Because along with the return of the Jews to the land of Israel and the rise of Jewish national sentiment, of which Zionism is that cause, will begin the rise of Arab nationalism, which is not an Arab thing, by the way. Arabs traditionally don't think in terms of nations. They think in terms of tribes and clans, like UAE is today. And then you have the pressure beginning already in the 1920s. You're going to have, primarily led by the Mufti, spreading lies about Jews, trying to take over the Temple Mount, etc., that will lead to explosions of violence against the Jewish population in urban centers in the land of Israel. And by the way, one more thing to talk about it all is, while Jerusalem is mentioned 669 times in the Hebrew Bible, and all Jews, wherever we are in the world, with or without a Jewish state or with or without a temple there, are always face where the gold dome is today in the old city to pray. Nowhere in the Quran does it mention Jerusalem anywhere. And that Islamic connection to that spot is based on taking a story in the Quran which doesn't mention Jerusalem and connecting it to Jerusalem, thus making it, this is the real short version of the story, for Sunni Muslims as of the late 7th century, the third holiest site. So even their connection to the Jerusalem is very different than ours.
I just want to pause you for a sec to show everyone this image here, which is of the Mufti visiting a concentration camp during the Second World War, because he collaborated with the Nazis. He told Hitler, I believe, that once the Nazis have got rid of the Jews of Europe, he wants to spearhead the role of getting rid of the Jews of the Middle East. And so this is who we're dealing with. These are the origins of the Arab leadership, distinct Arab leadership movement in Israel.
And by the way, to add, that's a great picture, but I never saw that one. And the Mufti and Hitler really liked each other. But you have to understand his interesting background. Christian anti-Semitism is based ultimately on the worst accusation against Jews is involved in the death of Jesus, which makes Jews physically threatening. If Jews can kill God's son, imagine what he could do to us. He can poison wells and kidnap our children and use their blood to bake matzah. So there's always been a much more kind of visceral, physical fear of Jews based on complete lies in the Christian world, which led to massive reactions and crusades and slaughters and accusations of blood libels and well poisonings. Islamic world did not have that traditionally. Muhammad interacts with Jews. He even fights battles with Jewish tribes and Jewish cities. Like if you read about Khaybar, which is a city that was subjugated by Muhammad. And the Jews are not viewed in the Quran as being physically threatening, but being deceptive and wanting to keep you from the truth, which is why the Arab armies were so surprised in 1948 and 67, because Jews don't fight, they run away. What the Mufti introduces, as you said correctly, the Christians brought in all these ideas, the blood libels, accusing Jews of the most nefariously evil things. The Mufti will introduce that into the Arab thinking. It is not indigenous thought processes to here. And you're right, he forges a very deep relationship with Hitler. Hitler, by the way, I have great quotes of Hitler saying he wished Islam had come to Germany, not Christianity. Because he said Islam, with its idea of jihad, holy war, would be so much better suited for his, the Nazi Reich conquest idea of pushing valor, kind of like the Viking mythology of going, Valhalla, and it's all about war and fighting. Christianity is about turning the other cheek. Hitler hated that. And also the very idea of the physical heaven, the 72 virgin thing, that's very Nordic kind of thing. If you read about Valhalla, which Hitler loved also. But he actually raised SS units in the Balkans. These are European Muslims to destroy the Jewish communities in that part of the world. And correct, he asked Hitler, when you conquer, had Rommel not been stopped at the Battle of El Alamein, when you conquer Palestine, would you please set up a death camp in the land of Israel so we can slaughter all the Jews there? But he's the one who really unleashes this poison into the Arab mind and the Arab world, which is till today poisoning. Now it doesn't appear as blood libels, it appears as Israel kidnapping or shooting Palestinian children to harvest their organs to sell in the international organ exchange, or accusations of raping and murder and things that are just not based in reality, but very sadly still there.
Just to clarify, but doesn't Muhammad then turn on the Jews later in the Quran? Isn't there a switch that occurs when they don't accept his Islamic theology?
Well, some of it's we know that Muhammad definitely originally, there's a lot of this is not in the Quran itself, but that Muhammad originally tried to make Islam closer to Judaism, even the direction of prayer being Jerusalem, in the hope of bringing Jews, who were a very significant minority and influential people, who would also give a lot of credibility. If the people who brought the idea of one God into the world say that you're his prophet, that's the best bona fides you can get there. Right. So yes, he definitely, like Martin Luther, the same thing. Martin Luther felt that Catholicism was so far from correct Christianity, and if we just behave like proper Christians, the Jews will do an about face and become Christians. And when they didn't, he became arguably the most prolific anti-Semitic writer, the founder of Protestantism. So yeah, there is a lot of that resentment, and the fact that this is a constant topic in history, that our continued existence and our refusal to join their faith, which is the replacement of our faith, always kind of, we're always like the little sore that's bothering that won't go away, that somehow delegitimizes their beliefs.
And so in the decades leading up to Israel's re-establishment, we see a rise in violence and pogroms by Arabs against the Jewish communities of British-controlled Palestine.
Right. So that's once the hostility begins, the British, and we could do a whole class, which we're not going to do now, on the British backpedaling on their promises to the Jews. But you have more Jews coming in, more Arab pressure to keep Jews out, more British succumbing to the Arab pressure to limit Jewish buying of property, to limit Jewish immigration to the land of Israel. So they wanted to shut it down. By 1940 and 1939, they said 15,000 Jews. This is the start of World War II when Jews had no place to go. 15,000 Jews over the next 5 years, 5,000 a year, and then no more Jewish immigration. But by this point, things have already reached a boiling point. There's been open violence directed at Jews. They always talk about the cycles of violence. There's never been a cycle of violence in the history of Jewish presence in the modern Middle East. It's always been started by someone else, and then we react to it. And then it quiets down and they start it again. Jews never instigate riots against Arabs in 1921 and 1929. Basically, the UN, decides the British decide to pull out and throw it onto the UN. November 29, 1947, the UN votes to partition Palestine. And even though Jews are left with a fraction of what they were supposed to get according to the original agreements, the Jews agree and the Arabs reject. And the British 5 months later will pull out. They just leave. And Israel declares itself a state and calls for peace. And 5 Arab armies declare war and invade. And the Arab population already in the land of Israel, who were there the whole time, have already risen up in revolt since the UN vote of November 29th. They've been ambushing the roads and attacking Jewish convoys and cutting off communities. The goal was divide, conquer, and push the whole thing into the water as soon as the British leave. So they say the War of Independence breaks out. No, it didn't. Arabs declared war to try to destroy Israel. It didn't break out. Had they accepted it, born along with Israel would have been an Arab state, not called Palestine, by the way, because the only people who called themselves Palestinians until May 14th, 1948, when Israel declared itself a state, were the Jews. There's a great Golda Meir video of her showing her British passport Palestinian Jew. The Arabs called themselves Arabs. The PLO was established.
What would they have called it?
Who knows? I don't know what they would have called it. Maybe they would have called it Palestine, but they would have called it Palestine, but not Palestine because they don't have the P sound. But right. We don't know because it never happened. But as a consequence, and this is where the refugee problem begins, we have to appreciate, to make a very long story short, between the UN vote, not only is there violence against Jews in Israel, there's massive violence against Jewish communities in the Middle East. Some of them have been there for literally thousands of years in places like Iraq. And Jews are slaughtered and persecuted. And there's pogroms, like these attacks against the communities. Between 1948 and 1967, the Arab Middle East, which contained at least 800,000 Jews who'd been living there, many of them for literally thousands of years, was completely ethnically cleansed of those populations, to the point where some Arab countries are completely devoid of any Jewish population anymore. A few have a couple thousand, maybe. Ironically, Iran has the largest Jewish population still. They're trapped in there. Morocco has a few thousand. There's a few hundred in one place over here. There's one in Lebanon left. But these countries, so they were all thrown out. Israel absorbed them all. So all the Sephardic Jews came home to the land of Israel, and a few of the better off ones in North Africa went to France or to Montreal. Meanwhile, as a consequence of many different factors in the land of Israel, in the battle zone, the Arab armies, first of all, they told the Arabs, move out of the way because you're going to be in the way of the fighting. We want to drive the Jews out. And there were definitely examples of Jews destroying Arab communities. Absolutely, especially on the road to Jerusalem, which were launching points for attacks against the roads. So the Jews just cleaned them out. These were places that they were using to launch attacks, to ambush cars, to cut Jerusalem off and starve the population. Those things definitely did happen. And of course, a lot of Arabs just chose to flee like they did after 1967. When the Jordanians fled back onto their internationally recognized border, all the Arabs just picked up and ran to get over the Jordan River on the Allenby Bridge. And Moshe Dayan goes there and stands on the bridge and says, no, stay here. Stay, live with us, So it's the exact opposite. So to say that Jews never drove any Arabs out of, the land of Israel and any of the fighting wouldn't be true. But to say that the majority of the population left either because the Arabs told them to get out of the way or they fled to get out of the way of fighting, which is a natural reaction of a civilian population to a conflict, would be true. The difference is those Palestinian refugees now have languished in a state of refugee status permanently in Arab states, literally for 80 years. Yeah. The only people in the world who remain refugees for 3, 4, 5 generations. And they're just kept in that state to be used as a whip to make Israel look bad with. So it's a sad byproduct. Sorry?
And for those Arab communities that the minority that were pushed out, one has to say that ultimately the Arab leadership and the surrounding Arab armies, they bear responsibility. Israel's engaged in a defensive war. They can see that you've got a population massively riled up towards bent on Israel's destruction. And once you start a war, like, don't don't blame us for having to do what we need to do to protect ourselves. Like, on every step of the way, Israel was prepared to live
Yeah.
alongside them, right?
Right. There would never have been any refugees of any kind had peace broken out in the Middle East. We know Israel
Right.
contains, it's not an apartheid state. 20% of the population of Israel are Arabs. But the other thing that people realize, because they hyper focus, just as they don't care what Assad did to millions of his own people in Syria, what's going on in South Sudan, the starvation breaking out in Yemen, no one cares about that. Tens of millions of people post World War II were exchanged in mass population exchanges. Germans thrown out of Czechoslovakia, India and Pakistan, much larger groups of people. But and they all were absorbed eventually. It's a very horrible, tragic thing to be made a refugee. But again, it happened to more Jews being thrown out of, who lost a lot more property and wealth, believe me, than the Arabs who living in what is today Israel did. What we settled our side of the bargain, they didn't theirs. And if the world really cared about them, they'd absorb them and find them. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, the Kuwaitis chucked out tons of Palestinians. So this is always going on, but only when we do it, it seems to matter, which is the saddest part of the whole thing, the lack of perspective of the world, or not only the
And
history
we're
of the Middle East.
also, it's happening under a context in which we're literally fighting for our survival and our existence. And throughout these 76 years of Israel's history, Israel has always consistently tried to find a way to make peace work. But it seems, and this is one of the points that I've tried to get across in a lot of our content, that if you study the history of the Arab-Palestinian movement and the creation of the flag in 1964, which, by the way, people have to remember existed prior to Israel taking hold of Gaza and Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, which they say is all they want. Well, some of the Palestinian leadership have said, but we know that that's not really the case. But it's clear. It seems so clear to me that it's been about. It's just a cynical ploy, this Arab-Palestinian identity, in order to get rid of Israel, and they would be happy to be part of some greater Islamic empire or southern Syria or whatever it is. For them, the issue is not nationalism. The issue is the Jews living there, right?
Exactly. And they say the quiet part out loud now. No one's screaming on university campuses, two-state solution. It's from the river to the sea, even though most of the people on university campuses don't even know what river and sea we're talking about.
Yeah.
But as you pointed out correctly, there have been multiple times, 1948, 1967, after the Six-Day War, when Levi Eshkol said, we'll give you the land back, even though legally it's not yours, Jordan or Egypt, just make peace. No, 2000, 2007, it's never been about creating a Palestinian state. Any Arab countries have been willing to make peace with Israel. Uncontestable fact, Israel has made peace and even given land. No one else gives land for peace. You get peace for peace. It's always been about the Arab world's inability. And a lot of the Arab world today, thank God, accepts Israel, but the Arab world's inability to accept a Jewish state of any size. As people love to say, if the Arabs put their guns down, there'd be peace. If Israel put her weapons down, she would be destroyed. And as you point out correctly, Israel's the only country in the world that fights defensive wars for its survival, that it never starts, wins the wars, and then is treated as if it lost the war and has to give back territory and be punished for defending itself. It's such an inversion of reality that if you wrote it as fiction, no one would believe it. But the problem is because no one knows the facts, they swallow all the nonsensical fiction surrounding this conflict.
Yeah. And so this is the other thing as well, this idea of giving back land. I say giving back, giving land.
Exactly.
Is there an issue with this approach that in some ways it's like almost like an admission of guilt, a false admission of guilt, by saying like, yeah, maybe you do have some ownership over this land. Like, do you think it's time for the Jewish people to be unequivocal now that we've seen that the cause was never really about some kind of national, genuine Palestinian nationalism? And now that we also have come to realize that our strongest argument is our ancient historical homeland, is it now time for us, the Jewish people, to say we're not indulging this nonsense anymore? Because even by the way, even if things were to change, we just can't trust the other side anymore, that they're not going to create another terror state, especially in the aftermath of October 7th. But more than that, they don't even have a strong nationalist claim. Not only do they not believe it, but they don't even have one. So is it time that we start to say clearly, we're not giving back any more land now, we're taking a new approach, and we're saying in one clear voice that the entirety of the land is Jewish?
I mean, you're right. You're right. That's the correct historical moral claim would be that. The question is whether you could do that or not. Certainly, there's no room for a 23rd Arab state in the Middle East in a piece of real estate the size of New Jersey that would return to being 9 miles wide from Qalqilia to Renana. There's no room for that. And we don't need it. When you have
Yeah.
22 Arab states with 5.5 million square miles of territory and 10,000 square mile Israel, including the territories, which is literally a matchbox sitting in a football field, the relationship between the size of Israel and the Arab
Wow.
states. And when we've seen with what they did with Gaza, and we see that 70% of the Arab population that lives in Judea and Samaria, that they call the West Bank, supports Hamas and has been indoctrinated to want basically genocide, the destruction of the Jewish people, there's nothing to talk about there. The biggest mistake Israel ever made was agreeing to even use the term Palestinian and saying that there was never you want to call yourself now a group of people called Palestinians, but to make an alternative claim which is based on a lie. There never was a Palestinian state. What was in Judea, Samaria before was Jordanian occupied territory. Before that, it was British occupied territory. Before that was Turkish occupied. But if you go back far enough, it just goes back to the Jews. Again, unless you could find a Canaanite. So that we bought into, and we even entertained the notion of a two-state solution. But look, practically speaking, Israel's not going to sit there and mass deport several million so-called Palestinians out of that territory. What Israel could do, the only thing possible would be, first of all, if you stop indoctrinating your children to hate us and become normal, industrialized, democratized kind of people, because no democracy's ever gone to war with another democracy in human history. Fact. Then we would consider creating some sort of autonomous territorial area here, which is demilitarized, and maybe do some sort of deal with some surrounding Arab state to give you passports or something. I just don't see, without, we're not bringing in, divine things happening and the Messiah coming and, but right now, given the current situation, it's not going to be that Israel's going to be deporting the population out of the country, but something has to be done that's in between what they want, which is the destruction of the state of Israel, or even the fake claim of just give us a piece of territory, an independent state there, which will then be used as a launching pad like Gaza is to destroy Israel. And the historical realities of the fact that they have really no right to a state in that part of the world. If they want to be look, Arabs have a right to be citizens of Israel, who are citizens of Israel, and they share the same democratic rights as any member of the state of Israel. So it's not a question of it's a racist, ethno-religious state that only tolerates one group of people, but we're kind of locked into a conflict that is very hard to get out of. But what we have to stop doing is pandering to lies that were created in history, that were created specifically to delegitimize our claim to the land. Because what starts out as seemingly as a way of, let's just give these poor people who are stuck between these Jordanians and these Jews over here a piece of real estate, turns into a call to obliterate the entire Jewish state and just make from the river to the sea the whole. And that's an ideology that just cannot be allowed. No country in the world would tolerate the situation that we find ourselves into today. And, as Eric Hoffer said, the writer, he said, Jews are the only people in the world who expected to actually act like Christians. We got to keep turning the other cheek.
Yeah.
But it's enough already. It's enough already.
My concern with like the autonomous zone thing that people talk about is that in some ways my fear is it produces the same result as what you get in Gaza. And I think part of the problem is the more we indulge this idea of two states, or you have an autonomous zone, you can have some of the land, we're basically feeding the lie. We're feeding the lie that these parts of the land is not Jewish. And I do understand that there's all kinds of big questions that would arise from all of the land becoming part of Israel. But I do note the fact that we see, correct me if I'm wrong, but Israeli Arabs far more cooperative, far more willing to live with peacefully Jews than those who are never exposed to Jews. And that's another problem you have with these autonomous zones, people who are never exposed to Jews in the first place. And I recognize that there may be some issues where you have some people who are just basic security threats, and my view is countries have the right to deport or detain people in their country that are security threats. But I also think that it's very plausible that many could also become peaceful and change and de-radicalized. And in terms of the democratic issues, I think the Jewish people are entitled to a home. And the Middle East has all kinds of, and you can still offer many basic rights and privileges to all citizenry, but in terms of having a say over the specific elements of governance, this is a phenomenon that we see throughout the Middle East, where it's strictly democratic. And I think the primary purpose of Israel is to be a Jewish state. And that is will be of enormous benefit, by the way, to non-Jews. And if I actually was a non-Jew and I had the choice of one country to live in the Middle East, regardless of how exactly it would manifest and what kind of form it would take, I would want to be in that Jewish state.
Absolutely. Yeah. First of all, I'm not advocating the autonomy thing. I'm just saying, the way it is and the way it ought to be. The way it ought to be is just recognition of reality that we got one teeny state and there's no room for another, and it ain't working out. But I always say, if you cannot live with the people who have been indoctrinated from birth to hate you and want you dead and think you're evil and think you're the descendants of monkeys and pigs and dogs, and that they have a right to slaughter you, and have in their charter that the tree, the day of redemption won't come until a Muslim makes wars against the Jews and kills them. The tree in Iraq say they're quoting right from the Hadith, which is in Islam, in Hamas's charter. People like that you cannot live with. No one in their right mind would live with a neighbor who sits outside his house all day with a shotgun waiting to kill you.
Yeah.
And that's what we're dealing with now. So, we're kind of stuck between the rock and the hard place. But so I'm not sure how the solution, I also believe I got to put on my rabbi hat now. I believe there's a God who runs the world, and the fact that we have a Jewish state after 2,000 years of exile and after a Holocaust and after having gone through the longest, most irrational, deepest hatred in the world, we rebuilt our state in the worst neighborhood in the Middle East. And that state is an unbelievable example of what you can do with a piece of real estate that was really kind of in a bad shape and surrounded by a lot of bad neighbors. And we turned it into really a miracle. There's definitely bigger things working here. And I know a lot of people are very rational. You can't rely on that. But as David Ben-Gurion said, by the way, and he said two great lines, he's not a religious man. First prime minister of Israel, head of the Jewish agency when Israel became a state. And he was a socialist, and he had a very good Jewish heart, and he knew his Bible well. When asked by the Peel Partition Plan Commission in 1937, when the British were trying to figure out what are we going to do with all this fighting, where he said, Mr. Ben-Gurion, where is your document of ownership or right to the land of Israel? He holds up a Bible. And he doesn't say, God gave me the land. No, he says the right to the land of Israel is not given by the Balfour Declaration or the British Mandate. It's the right to the land of Israel comes from the Bible, written by the Jewish people in the land of Israel thousands of years ago. He doesn't bring in God and divine rights. It's as old as the Jewish people itself. This is a great way of making the case, because it's going back to the essential argument that we're an ancient people and we've been here for thousands of years, regardless of God in the picture or not is not the issue. But he had another great quote. When we look at the situation that seems to be kind of insoluble, and the Arab population, Golda Meir said like 60 years ago, we'll only have peace with the Arabs when they love their children more than they hate us. And this was way before you had any suicide bombers and this whole adoration of the shihadi, the shaheed, the martyrdom thing. It's gotten much worse since then. So we're not moving in that direction at all. But Ben-Gurion, Ben-Gurion said it great. He said, to be a realist as a Jew, you have to believe in miracles. And that is, I believe we are stuck in almost an insoluble situation based on the normal rules of how it works in this world and the crazy double standard we're subjected to, precisely because it's never been the Jewish people's way to do things kind of in a normal way. We have a different role to play in human history, and we'll get out of this, but it just might come from a bit out of left field, as we say in American baseball terminology.
Yeah.
But as Golda Meir also said, pessimism is an emotion the Jewish people can never afford to have. We've managed to pull through everything so far. So
it's funny because there's two things that I do feel about that. There is that, there's Ben-Gurion saying, like, talking about the Bible. I actually think that invoking God and God's, of course, there's these points of, from a historical perspective, from a biblical perspective, from an international law perspective, from a basic moral perspective, from a sociological perspective, the Jewish people have the rights to the land. However, I do think, given the context of the region we're in, and given the context of our people and the origins of our people and the mission of our people, I do think that actually bringing into the equation the fact that God assigned this land to the Jewish people, especially when actually the majority of the world do believe and worship the God of Abraham, I think it's something that really is important to say. And the other thing I would say is that my personal feeling has been that, while on the one hand, yes, it does seem like we are trying to solve an intractable problem in Israel and the Middle East, and with this issue of radical Islam. On the other hand, yes, while on the one hand, yes, absolutely, we'll have to depend on God and we have to pray, and absolutely there's that spiritual element to it, it does seem to me that there's this shift that occurs, and it's sort of right now kind of what we're getting up to in our Torah reading of the year, where it seems like once we now have to shift into going into the land of Israel, like conquering the land and inhabiting it. And Moses says to God, the people are saying to me they want to get spies into the land. What do we do? Do I not? And instead of God just giving directives and instructions and us all kind of living in the desert and being totally dependent, now God's like, I don't know, what do you think you should do? Like, so it suddenly shifts at that point. So now he's putting it into our hands and saying, not just there's the spiritual work, but also part of the spiritual work is go into the physical world and do your hishtadlut, do your practical side. And so I think, just as yes, on the one hand, we have to look upwards, also we have to, I think we should be, my feeling is I want to be seeing more boldness from Israel in taking bold, pragmatic steps, which I think is part of that spiritual effort that we have to put in. I don't know if you have any reflections on that.
No, I agree. By the way, yeah, one thing you see is even the people who hate us respect those of us who have strong sense of ourselves. You see that
Yes,
Arabs may not like the Israeli right, but they respect them more than the Israeli left because they realize
absolutely.
these people are ideologically motivated and they mean business and they stand by what they believe. And kowtowing and giving in, especially in the Middle East, you have to understand negotiating in the Middle East. If you pay the asking price, you're a sucker. You always have to begin from a position of exaggerated demands. So to stand up, not to be cruel, not to be humiliate, but to be proud and strong and tough and intractable in your beliefs would go a long way. And since, well, with one thing we see, Ali, is that no matter what we do and how much we, even though we behave better in warfare and the lowest, in the hardest and fighting since Stalingrad wasn't even this bad, what's going on in Gaza. And there's probably the lowest civilian to combatant casualty figure in the world. And everything Israel's doing, they're not going to ever, even if we lie down and let ourselves be shot, there'll still be UN resolutions condemning the Jewish people. So there's got to be a point where we have to point out the hypocrisy, tell the world this is what we are going to do, point out where they're being hypocritical and why being right. And those who are going to listen will hear, and those who are not going to listen aren't going to listen no matter what we do. And if we commit suicide, they'll still condemn us at the funeral. So
Exactly.
so
Yeah.
that has to stop for sure, because you're
Yeah.
seeing more of this now than I've ever seen before. The
Yeah.
level of hypocrisy and double standard is absolutely mind blowing, and basically it like goes back to what this whole conversation is about: is how much of the truth do you want to have? How much of the truth do you want your narrative, or do you want to know what's really going on? Because
Absolutely.
anyone who makes any effort to even look what's going on now or the history of Israel recognizes that this is the most unambiguously clear struggle in human history. And no people has had a better nationalist claim for a homeland than the Jewish people. And no people has gone more out of their way to behave in a humanitarian way against an intractable enemy who's been trying to destroy us literally for decades, and they're only getting worse. They're only getting more violent.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
so we have nothing to apologize for. And you're right, and I agree. Those people who support the Jewish people, especially in the Christian world, are very happy to hear Jews, saying it right out there. This is the land of
Yeah.
Israel. God gave us the land. You can't maybe introduce that as an international court case, in front of a judge as evidence, but there's, trust me,
I'd give it a go.
the other side, believe me, who are very particularist Islamic, are
Yeah.
motivated overwhelmingly by a religiously based, albeit hyper radicalized version of Islam. But even basic Islam has some pretty expansionist, aggressive ideas of dominance about the rest of the world that is intrinsic to that worldview. So yeah, we have to stand up for who we are and say it like it is, and stand up for the truth, and not being apologizing and giving stuff, because we see the giving stuff never works. It never works. It just eggs them on to want more stuff and puts us in a greater
Absolutely.
position of danger.
Yeah, and I'll finish with a quote that I saw from it was some kind of political professor. No, he's a journalist and author, Sol Stern, American, I think, and he said how dispiriting it is to recall the many occasions over the past 100 years on which well-meaning Israeli officials fell into the trap of believing that this Islamist Nazi ideological movement could be bribed into relative normalcy with political gifts and accommodations, which I think says it all, doesn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. Rabbi, thank you so much for your time. Rabbi Ken Spiro, historian, author. He's got a selection of fantastic books and crash courses, which you can find on Amazon. He's also got a website. What was the website?
Spiro.com.
.com. Great. Well, there's plenty more lectures and videos that you can see. Thank you
I
so
also
much for
do
your time.
I also do a podcast every week on current events in Jewish history called Remember What's Next. So if
Okay, and
anyone's
that can be accessed where?
on Apple, Spotify, Google, Anchor, you name it. Remember What's Next. Good title for a history podcast.
I love that. That's great. All right. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Rabbi Ken Spiro.
Thanks for having me on always.
And thank you to everyone for watching. Appreciate it. For watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.